For those who've just joined, my name is Benjamin Rifkin. I am professor of Russian at Hofstra University in the Department of Comparative Literature, Languages, and Linguistics. And this evening, we are going to be looking at the coup that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in August 1991. At this time, I am recording. I will be recording through the remarks that I'll be making. And then we'll show a film when we will not be recording. So for those of you who are watching this not live, not participating in the Zoom, you will have a disruption in the middle of your screening experience when we go from my remarks to the panel discussion. And I recognize that many of the people who have come tonight and are part of the attendees, among the attendees this evening, are specialists in the study of Russia. Many are faculty members in schools and colleges across the country. Many are immigrants from the former Soviet Union who were in the Soviet Union when these events transpired. But there are also individuals joining us tonight who are unfamiliar with Soviet history. And so for them, in particular, I make these remarks to help contextualize the film that we're about to start watching. So, and I promise you this history that I'm going to share with you is going to move very rapidly. In the late winter of 1917, the Russian imperial government collapsed under a spontaneous protest that led in that time to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. Other family members of the Romanov family declined to take the throne, and a provisional government was established. That provisional government lasted several months, and in the fall of 1917, depending on the calendar you're using, it was on October 25th or November 7th, Vladimir Lenin, leading the Bolshevik Party, Bolshevik fraction of the Communist Party, mounted a coup. I'll call it a coup and not a revolution, although it's referred to as the Russian Revolution, that ended the rule of the provisional government, and after a period of a few years of civil war, ultimately led to the establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, also often called the Soviet Union. And it was led by Vladimir Lenin until 1924. It is important for the film that you'll be seeing to understand that some people in the film will be referring to the events of the fall of 1917, not as the Russian Revolution, but as a coup, which I think is an actually more accurate term. Following Lenin's death in 1924, there was a period in which individuals in the leadership team struggled and outmaneuvered one another to gain solitary leadership. And as I'm sure all of us are aware, the person who outmaneuvered everyone else was none other than Joseph Stalin, who ruled the Soviet Union as General Secretary of the Communist Party and other titles that were attached to him for approximately 25 years, during which time his authoritarian leadership created calamity after calamity, costing the lives of millions of people, including the spectacular failure of inadequate preparation for what many would describe as the inevitable and predictable invasion of Nazi forces in the summer of 1941. After Stalin's death in 1953, again, after a few years of an interregnum, the leadership of the Soviet Union passed to a man by the name of Nikita Khrushchev, or Khrushchev, as he might be more familiar to some of you. And during Khrushchev's leadership of the Soviet Union, there were, from 1956 to 1964, there were some measurable improvements in living conditions and a relaxation of the regime of terror characteristic of the preceding Stalin administration. However, in part due to failures domestic and international, and in part for other reasons that are beyond the parameters of the discussion we can have today, Khrushchev was removed from leadership in a coup in 1964. And again, this is relevant to the film that we'll watch tonight. So we have a coup in 1917 and a coup in 1964 that removes Khrushchev from leadership. And he is the first of only two Soviet leaders to survive the end of their time in the leadership position in the Soviet Union. And the person who comes to power in that coup is a man by the name of Leonid Brezhnev. And we can talk about the Brezhnev era beginning in 1964 and actually going past his death in 1982 until March of 1985. Because although Brezhnev died in 1982, the individuals who succeeded him continued in many ways his key policies, which I'll talk about in a moment, and were themselves roughly his contemporaries in age and died not long after themselves taking power. In March of 1985, after the death of the second of these successors of Leonid Brezhnev, Mikhail Gorbachev, or as I mentioned earlier, the American version of his name is Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power and announced three initiatives for the reform of Soviet society and economy. Perestroika, or the reconstruction of the state and all of its functions and the economy. Glasnost, or openness in terms of understanding Soviet history and being transparent about practices, policies, and procedures. And demokratizatsiya, or the democratization of local politics in the Soviet Union. As my students in my Russian history class this semester, many of whom are on this Zoom right now, and I salute you, you know that I am very glad you're here, pointed out very recently in our class, glasnost is incompatible with authoritarianism. And so the opening of archives and the spread of actual information was bound to lead to greater dissent. And the advent of new technologies also supported a more rapid flow of information across borders that had previously seemed impenetrable. The Brezhnev administration was devoted to protecting the privileges and advantages of the Soviet elite. And Gorbachev's challenge was to manage the expectations of the elite who were in positions of leadership throughout the country, while at the same time managing the expectations of individuals with a growing sense of their own voice in the sense of glasnost, as well as a series of very significant challenges that occurred in the time of his leadership of the Soviet Union. The first of those challenges I'll mention is the Chernobyl explosion at the nuclear facility in April of 1986, the Armenian earthquake, the outbreak of actual military conflict between two Soviet socialist republics, two parts of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan and Armenia, the shooting of protesters in Tbilisi, demonstrations in the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, seeking independence and freedom, and significant economic decline because the new economic initiatives that Gorbachev was unrolling had not yet been able to make a difference in the lives of the Soviet people. These are all internal challenges that are have to be understood in the context of the Soviet political system, which seemed to be slipping out of control of the elite of the membership of the Communist Party. At the same time that this was happening, the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet bloc fell with it. In all but one instance, those revolutions happened spontaneously and peacefully as populations demonstrated that they were not satisfied with Soviet puppet governments in their countries. And the one country that had a very brutal revolution was Romania. Gorbachev understood the writing on the wall, so to speak, and he and his allies were in the spring of 1991, amid declarations of independence from some of the republics, preparing for a change in the political structure of the country, which would remove the leading role, some would say, I think also accurately, the monopoly of the Communist Party in the political structure of the government, and turn the USSR into a confederation, one that would have some elements of unity, such as a single currency, foreign policy, trade facilitated among the republics, and other features, but also with laws based in each republic reflecting the cultures of the peoples who lived there. A significant date for that process was set for August 20th, 1991, when Boris Yeltsin, in his capacity as the first ever democratically elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, one of the constituent republics of the USSR, and other presidents of Soviet republics, would sign a founding document of the new confederation that would be called the Union of Soviet Sovereign Republics, keeping the same initials in Russian, SSSR, and even the same short name of the country, the Soviet Union. For those who don't know Russian, by the way, the word Soviet means advice or counsel, and so the word does not inherently have any authoritarian meaning, only in its application in the actual Soviet Union. Members of the elite gerontocracy, together with the KGB, were determined to prevent this confederation from happening because they didn't want to accept the idea of the end of the Soviet Union as a unified state with Communist Party and KGB control. They were angry at the loss of the satellite states and at the loss of their own social and economic privilege. And they planned their coup to occur on August 19th, while Gorbachev himself would still be on vacation in Crimea before the signing of the document. Their plan was to declare martial law and prevent the confederation from ever being realized. The committee that directed this coup is sometimes referred to in Russian as the GKCHP, the State Committee for the Extraordinary Situation. And it consisted of 8 individuals. I won't bother you with their names right now, who are also sometimes referred to as the Gang of 8. They signed a resolution number 1, introducing a state of emergency for 6 months in certain areas of the USSR. That would begin at 4 a.m. Moscow time on August 19th. They prohibited rallies, demonstrations, strikes, and suspended the activities of all political parties, public organizations, and mass movements. And they also took over the state radio and television starting from 6 a.m. The KGB issued an arrest list, including the Russian President Boris Yeltsin, as well as his allies, and the leaders of the umbrella activist group Democratic Russia. Independent radio and television stations were temporarily cut off the air and subsequently were able to resume transmitting and became a source of information during the coup throughout the country. And people were also listening in the Soviet Union to news about their own country from the BBC World Service and the Voice of America, as well as other external sources. Gorbachev and his family were put under house arrest in the dacha they were staying in the Crimea. And for several days, he refused to take any food because he was afraid that it was poisoned. On this day, tanks rolled into Moscow, and there were around 4,000 soldiers, paratroopers in Moscow, as well as 350 tanks, 300 armored personnel carriers, and 400 trucks that were mobilized in Moscow in particular. Yeltsin traveled to the White House, Russia's parliament building, in order to maintain communications with other opponents of the coup. And in the afternoon of that day, the citizens of Moscow began to gather around the White House, the parliament building, and erect barricades around it to try to protect their government, which they considered to be legitimate and a democracy. The coup eventually failed, but not before it took the lives of 3 Russian men who died trying to defend the constitutional structure of the Soviet Union against the military putsch under the control of the KGB. Gorbachev, who had very few months left in leadership after this, named those 3 individuals to be heroes of the Soviet Union. And as far as I know, they're the last individuals to have that name. Within 3 days, it was all over with remarkably little violence. Gorbachev was back in the seat of power, although he was enfeebled in ways that he could not possibly have imagined before the coup. Yeltsin's prestige was higher than it had ever been, and probably than it would ever be. The leaders of the attempted coup were all arrested for treason. One of them committed suicide. And republic after republic within the Soviet Union voted to declare its independence from the USSR, many doing so even before the end of August. So remember, the coup starts on August 19th. The Communist Party was abolished in the Russian Federation, its property confiscated by the government of the RSFSR, which was the Russian Republic within the Soviet Union. And the Russian Republic soon changed its name to the Russian Federation, which is what it's named today, as well as its flag and its currency. What we are about to see now, and I'll explain what this is before I stop the recording, is a documentary film by the Ukrainian filmmaker Sergei Loznitsa, who has made not only many documentary, but also fiction films, and I highly recommend his work. And this documentary film is about what happened in Leningrad, which is not the center where the coup is unfolding, on the day of the coup. It consists of archival footage. For those of you who are not watching this live, you will, if you want to see the film, you will have to find where it is streaming in services, that streaming services to which you subscribe. Hofstra is not able to make that film available to you. I'm going to stop recording now and get the film up ready to show. Welcome back, everyone. We are recording. We've just watched the film, The Event by Sergei Loznitsa, and in a moment we will start our panel discussion. I do want to tell you that I've seen this film a couple of times. Every time I watch it, I discover something else. At the time that the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, there was a minor KGB official stationed in East Berlin by the name of Vladimir Putin, not particularly well known, and not someone who was in a major leadership position. Within a few months of the fall of the Berlin Wall, East and West Germany were reunified under the auspices of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. And Putin returned to the Soviet Union to resume service in the KGB. I see someone saying that he was in Dresden, not Berlin. Thank you. But he was in East Germany. He returned to the Soviet Union. And in this film that we just saw, somewhere between minutes 21 and 22, Putin emerges from a building and gets into a car. So on the day of the coup, he shows up in this documentary in Leningrad, a minor figure at the time, but with a very important and complicated future ahead of him. I recognize that there were questions being asked and answered on the chat, and I appreciate the engagement of my colleagues who are specialists in Russian culture and Russian history and Russian politics around the country, who are with us today, who participated in answering those questions on the chat. I turned my chat off during the screening of the film so that it would not disturb you in your viewing of the film. At this point, we'll transition to our panel discussion. We have 4 speakers. I will introduce each of them in turn as they're about to speak. And I just want to say that, remind you that the point of today's event is not to analyze the events from the perspective of international politics and the stuff of textbooks, but rather, what was it like to be a person living in this country with these tremendous events unfolding all around you, and the uncertainty of what it means for your life, the lives of your families, the lives of your friends, and the future of your children if you have them, or if one day you will. So speaking first tonight is my friend and colleague Ilya Vinitsky. He is professor of Russian at Princeton University. He's from Moscow, and during the coup, he was in Moscow and was an eyewitness to the demonstrations in Moscow. So Ilya, if you could unmute yourself, and I will mute myself, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you for introducing me. I was there. It was a very strange experience, and now I had this déjà vu film when I watched the film by Lesnitsa, and the film is absolutely marvelous, and I felt so much related, so I had to review my own recollections while viewing the film. But I will start with the question which you asked the panel to think about, and I will offer some of my recollections, observations, not only as an eyewitness, but also as a literary scholar who is interested in emotions and history of emotions. So the question was, what these 3 days meant for you as they were unfolding wherever you were. So almost every spring, I teach a class on Tolstoy's historical epic novel, War and Peace, and I start every first meeting with a question addressed to students. Have you ever felt that you lived in a historical moment, as if the history went through you? You've experienced its presence, and you and your peers still remember, share this moment, these memories? If yes, can you name the moment? It is interesting that every American generation of students offered, in my experience, a different response to this romantic, idealistic question. 15, 20 years ago, the most common response was September 11th. Then it was not really. A few years ago, it was yes to the first iPhone on January 9th, 2007. Last 2 years, it was the pandemic and the social justice movement. In my own life, I had a moment of this kind. And when I recall it, I feel a strange mixture of excitement, pride, with some degree of melancholy. In the summer of 1991, I just graduated from Moscow State Pedagogical University and joined a graduate program at the Institute of World Literature in Moscow. As numerous other Muscovites, I was shocked and angry when I saw tanks rather than trams driving by my windows in early morning. My major sources of information at the time were the radio of Moscow and my friends' phone calls every single minute. There was no internet then, believe me or not. My mom was frightened and did not want to let me go outside. Yet, my friends and I, on the 20th of August, went directly to the White House in Moscow in order to take a look at what was going on and, as it turned out, to experience this special feeling of history, the history which was literally developed before our eyes. At the White House, we saw huge crowds of people split into many self-organized groups, which were building barricades. One of the most exciting feelings was that it's possible to split the body of the crowd into well-organized groups, self-organized groups, although, of course, there was some kind of navigation as well. To be honest, everything was, and I clearly remember it, a bit weird, like in a dream. And believe me or not, kind of funny, although everyone was certainly scared, and we already heard about the first victim. Thus, I clearly remember the episode is actually presented in Lesnitsa's film. I didn't even know about that in Leningrad, it was the same thing. I clearly remember an elderly woman with fiery eyes who approached to us and asked suddenly, "Do you have handkerchiefs? Why? There's going to be a gas attack soon, so you need to soak them with water in a puddle and put them on your faces to protect yourself." I have never been a brave person, and besides, I did not have a handkerchief at that moment. And moreover, I did not think that a puddle mask was hygienic enough, so I left. And one of my friends stayed. He was brave, romantic, and above all, curious. Two girls from my former university stayed as well. They felt it was their moral duty. Actually, it was one of the most common motivations. I returned to the barricades later in the morning of the 21st, but by the time it was already more or less clear that the coup failed. People were excited, agitated. Some of them seemed drunk, but probably it was just the high degree of agitation. They cried and they laughed loudly. For a while, it seemed to me that a true miracle had just happened, and the long physical night, the Soviet night, was almost over. From a very long distance, I saw Yeltsin and his team on the balcony of the White House. I did not hear a single word he was saying, but I remember that people shouted out political slogans and doggerels, which were composed impromptu. I still remember one of those poems, Born by the Revolution. We witnessed this in Loznitsa's film, the role of poems, of poetry, of popular poems, just composed impromptu, of rock music, presentation of old poems, recited. I would say that this is a specifically Russian-Soviet phenomenon. So I heard this doggerel in which Yeltsin was mentioned along with his military supporter, General Kabets. The doggerel, which was reproduced by thousands of voices, was happy but a bit obscene. In Russian, «С нами Ельцин и Кабец, Хунте наступил конец». In my translation, hail to Yeltsin and his crew, we just stopped the effing coup. My American friend rendered it differently. Yeltsin and Kabets was struck, so the juntas. There is a reason why I quote these silly and crude lines. In my memory, they somehow connect the feeling of that absolute historical, almost religious happiness with the total poshless, banality, or vanity of its aftermath, symbolized in my memory by cheering crowds and faces of some new politicians who came from the same system to run the new country, the country of our dream. In the tragic poem written a century earlier, and also as a Russian referred to a poem, the poet Osip Mandelstam wrote, "Let us praise the twilight of freedom, brothers." I remember that what I felt that day was something opposite to this heroically apocalyptic sentiment. I guess I experienced in the morning of the 21st a kind of hangover of freedom, which as it turned out was a very positive historical experience, since at the age of 22, I suddenly learned that even the greatest historical moment of one's life was followed by sadness, frustration, disillusionment, because historical process is long, complicated, mostly prosaic, bloody, troubled, or painfully boring. Contrary to the normal cycle, in history, long nights and cold twilights often follow bright dawns. Thus, in my biographical calendar, the early morning of August 21st, 1991, was the moment of historical maturity, a peculiar mixture of optimistic idealism with the realm of sober irony and sadness. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. That was beautiful and powerful. And I know I speak on behalf of everyone attending live tonight and those who will watch the recording when I say thank you. We will be having questions for all the panelists later, but we are going to have all the presentations first. So our next speaker is Natasha, my colleague and friend Natalia Ushakova, who is a teacher of Russian at Staten Island Technical High School. She's from Moscow, and during the coup, she was visiting with her grandparents in Grodno in Belarus. And so, Natasha, if you could unmute yourself and speak, we'd appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much for all participants. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I graduated from high school in 1980, Soviet Union. At this time, studying the history of the country was learning the congresses of the Communist Party. the beginning of the renewal and changes, my years in Moscow State University, and simultaneous work in the Museum of Vladimir Mayakovsky, reading the most popular Ogonyok, editor-in-chief Korotich. Interesting thing was happening at this time. It was a process of changes. And my mother's friend was the editor of the publishing house Художественная литература, the Soviet monster, where was decided whose work would be published. In all seriousness, she told me that if I defend my thesis based on the literature work of Yuri Trifonov, I will never get the highest mark. I didn't even want to discuss this topic. I was not scared. I was not afraid. August 1991. On such a day, you somehow do not think about the country, about politics. You guess what will happen to your family, with your little sons. How will you live in the new reality? Only those questions occupied me the most at this moment. Whatever happens in the country, you need to feed your children, walk with them, read fairy tales. We tried to watch TV, but it showed only ballet and the tank, a talk of some strange and nervous people. Grodno, Belarusia, where I was on vacation with my sons, 3 and 2 years old at that time, at my grandparents', is located 45 kilometers from the Polish border. We always watched Polish TV, movies, and the news. Just by the switch of the channel, you can see a different perspective of political events. And usually my step-grandfather translated for us. On that day, everything was quiet. I did not remember any conversation. Interesting that I was in Grodno at the time of Chernobyl too. On the day of the COP on August 19, I felt scared for my children, for my family. On this day, I decided to leave the country. It was a day of one of the most crucial decisions I made, and we arrived to New York in 1994. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Natasha. That was very interesting and a powerful reminder for all of us that as major historical events unfold that occupy leaders, elected leaders and appointed leaders and military leaders and the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, mothers and fathers think about their children and think about what the day will bring and what the next day will bring. Our next speaker is Anna Thales, who is a programmer at Cisco. And at the time of the coup, she was home in Kazan, the capital of the former Soviet Autonomous Tatar Socialist Republic, or Soviet Autonomous Socialist Republic of Tatarstan. So Anna, if you could unmute yourself. I can't see you yet, and speak. There you go.
There we go. Hi, everyone. I have to say that in the first minute of the film, this wonderful, wonderful film, I actually laughed. And the reason I laughed is when you asked me to participate in this panel, I said, I don't think I'm qualified because all I remember was that my father was away and we were very worried about him. And the Swan Lake on TV. So there it was, the Swan Lake on TV. It was, I really don't remember much, and I don't know why. I was 18 and maybe I was too busy with my unrequited love at that summer. I don't know. But I had to check with my parents actually about what was going on. And just to refresh my memory. And we didn't know anything. In Kazan, there was not, the only news was the TV and the radio, and it was Swan Lake on TV, and there was nothing on the radio. And people just didn't know anything. My mom said that gradually there were news trickling in through people calling to people in Moscow. So it was the only source of information we had. you asked me also, you mentioned that, what does it mean for the Soviet people, the Swan Lake on TV? And what it was, we experienced that several years before when Brezhnev died, then Chernenko, then Andropov. So it was a national mourning. And when there was several days of national mourning, there was nothing on TV but, Swan Lake and all the other ballets, televised ballets and symphonic music. So not only was there no news coming in, there was also this dread of Gorbachev dying. We were told he was sick. And because we associated that music with the leaders dying, this kind of, it really added to the overall dread and uncertainty. So I think that's all I can really bring.
That's fine, and there'll be questions. There'll be questions later. I do want to comment on that, in that for many people in the Soviet Union in these days of the coup, if you weren't in Moscow or Leningrad, or you weren't near a border with another country where you could get TV and understand it, because certainly many people, for instance, in Karelia might have been able to get Finnish TV, but they might not have been able to understand Finnish. The sense that Swan Lake is playing, as Anna pointed out, and yet there's no information, fills the Soviet people with dread and anxiety that something horrific has happened, but there's no news, there's no explanation, we don't know what's going on. And as one of the things that was very compelling to me as I watched the film and also listening to your remarks is my own memory, not of August 19th, 1991, when I was glued to CNN all day, watching the TV on a day that for me was personally designated as supposed to be a very romantic day because it was the 1-year anniversary of my wife's and my wedding. And there I was, we were glued to CNN watching what was happening in the Soviet Union. But actually, for me, this event connects to January 6th of 2021, of this year, and thinking what is happening and not being certain, and feeling all kinds of feelings of anxiety and dread. And so I think, as an American, that is the most recent comparison for me. And Ilya, I look forward to hearing from you about what your students say in the spring of 2022 about their sense of an historical event that they've lived through in your War and Peace seminar.
It's interesting. It's the same thing without the internet. So imagine the same thing with no internet and no TV.
That's right.
What you get.
That's right. And again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, one of the things that the committee, the Gang of Eight, the committee for the extraordinary situation was able to do somewhat successfully was close down broadcast news, which meant that information flowed only by personal contact, as Anna was saying. Our final panelist tonight is not Russian. This is Eleanor Sutter. She is a retired US foreign officer, diplomat. At the time of the coup, she was assigned to the political section of the US Embassy in Moscow and was in Moscow during the coup. So Eleanor, if you could, I think you've unmuted yourself, you can just start talking. Tell us about what you experienced.
Well, hello, everyone. I'll start by telling you what happened to me on the morning of the coup, and then I'd like to tell you a few things about the next 2 days when I observed the events very closely. I was inside the Russian parliament while they were deliberating about what to do about the coup. But on the morning of the coup, August 19th, my daughter, who was a graduate student in Massachusetts, was visiting me. It was the last day of her visit, and we were planning to go to the airport later, and we did not turn on the radio. We had no idea what was happening. And suddenly the phone rang, and it was a man I knew slightly. He was the husband of a friend of mine, and he said, "Ellie, are you okay? You're not surrounded by tanks, are you?" And I thought he was making a joke, and I said, "No, no tanks here." He said, "Can I come and see you?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Can I bring my brother?" And I had never even met his brother, but I said, "Sure, bring your brother." And they arrived at my apartment at about 10:30 in the morning, and I greeted them, and they said, "You don't know what's happened, do you?" I said, "No, I haven't turned on the radio." And they told me about the coup. And the reason they had come to see me was that they knew that my daughter was going home to Massachusetts on that day. And the brother's daughter was a Russian student in Massachusetts. And the brother wanted my daughter to take a letter to his daughter telling her never to come home again, because he didn't want his daughter to grow up in the world that he thought was going to be Russia after that coup. So after 10 days in Russia, visiting monasteries and museums, my daughter had a direct experience of what Russian history does to people's personal lives. We did manage to get her to the airport. We couldn't drive through Moscow because the tanks were blocking all the roads, but we drove around the outside ring road. We got to the airport, the planes were running. And then the next day, I reported to work at the embassy. And because I had pretty good Russian, they sent me immediately to the Russian White House to sit in the Russian parliament and listen to the debate and report back to the embassy what was going on. So I went through the crowds that were surrounding the Russian White House. It was drizzling on that day, and there were crowds of very somber people under their umbrellas with little transistor radios listening to Echo Moscow, because Echo Moscow was the only radio station that was broadcasting any news. All the official radio stations had no news. And Echo Moscow was going from one apartment to another, trying not to let themselves be shut down by the authorities. So that was the only source of information for the people out on the square. They were out there in the rain with their umbrellas, and they were defending the Russian White House with their bodies. They had no weapons. There was also a ring of tanks around the Russian White House, and we learned later that those tanks were there to protect Yeltsin and the Russian White House from a possible attack by the coup plotters. Anyway, we walked through the crowd. We got inside the Russian White House. My friend Toria Newland, who covered internal affairs in Russia, went up to Yeltsin's office, and I went into the parliament to the gallery that was for diplomats and journalists, because during this crisis, it was very important to the Russians that the outside world should be a witness to what was happening. I had a big yellow pad of paper, and as I listened to the debate in Russian, I wrote my notes in English, and I had an American embassy courier by my side. And as soon as something important happened, I would tear off my notes and give them to the courier, and he would run back to the American embassy, and they would transmit the information to Washington. That went on for 2 days. And finally, as I sat in the parliament and they were discussing what to do, the message came through from the coup plotters inviting Yeltsin to come to negotiate with them, where they were holding Gorbachev. And the entire group of deputies in the parliament said, "No, don't go, don't trust them." But very soon after that, the word came through that the coup had failed. And Yeltsin went out onto the balcony to tell the crowd that they had won and that the coup plotters had fled. And I was on that balcony standing behind Yeltsin as he gave his talk to the crowd. And after Yeltsin spoke, Eduard Shevardnadze, who at that time was the Soviet foreign minister, but who later became the president of Georgia, gave a speech, and he said, "Da zdravствует Россия, da zdravствует россияне." And he was very happy. After him, there was a speech by Father Gleb Yakunin, who was a Russian priest who had been a dissident, and he had been imprisoned by the Soviet authorities at one point, but he was out, and he gave a Russian Orthodox prayer to celebrate the victory. And I watched the crowd. There were very few people who knew when to make the sign of the cross. So this was not a religious crowd, it was a secular crowd for the most part. But Father Gleb said, "Let's go to the Kremlin, let's take the Kremlin." And they all marched down Kalininsky Prospekt, which is a big avenue that leads from where the Russian White House was located down to the Kremlin. They went down to the Kremlin, they took down the Soviet flag, and they put up the Russian flag over the Kremlin for the first time in 74 years. And that night, my colleague and I were walking around downtown Moscow, and we went to Dzerzhinsky Square. Now, the students who are listening may not know that Felix Dzerzhinsky was the founder of the NKVD. It was the precursor to the KGB. It was a terrible organization that arrested people and killed people and tortured people and sent people to the concentration camps. And Dzerzhinsky's statue was right up there in the middle of the square. And it was about 8 p.m. and there were fireworks flashing on the statue because there were fireworks to celebrate the victory. And all around the statue were graffiti saying, "Doloi Kommunism," "Doloi KGB," and all around Lubyanka prison, which was on that square, were the same graffiti. And the crowd had
I
a
could
noose
interrupt for
around
just a moment to say that that means down with communism and down with the KGB, because some of
Right.
our attendees don't know Russian. Thank you.
Sorry. So there was a noose around the statue of Dzerzhinsky, and the crowd was trying to pull down the statue. And all of a sudden, a motorcade arrived on the square, and out of the first car came Sergei Kovalyov, who had been a dissident during the Soviet period. He had served time in prison. And he got up on the top of his limousine with a megaphone, and he said, "Don't pull down that statue." He said, "That statue belongs to the Moscow City Council. And if our victory today means anything, it means that we should have the rule of law in Russia and not mob rule. And you should get permission from the Moscow City Council to take down that statue." And he got back into his car and he drove away. And then they pulled down the statue anyway. Anyway, I could tell you a lot of stories, and if there's a question period, I'd be happy to answer questions, but I'd like to leave time for the questions.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was amazing to hear your eyewitness account from such close proximity to these extraordinary events. Before we turn to our Q&A, I would like to point out one moment in the film that may have been a little bit confusing for some of the viewers. There's reference to Smolny, which is in Leningrad, a Communist Party headquarters, and where a lot of files were kept. And the people entered into that building to seal the offices so that authorities could properly look at the files and reveal history that had been hidden from the people. Very different from the entry of protesters, rioters into the US Capitol on January 6th. This was an attempt to restore rule of law. And Eleanor, your comment about Sergei Kovalyov's reference to the Dzerzhinsky statue reminded me about that difference. So what I'd like to do now for about 10 minutes is open up for questions to any of our panelists. What I need to ask you to do is to raise your hand using the Zoom function. There are over 100 attendees at this point in the Zoom room. And so we'll need to have you raise your hand or put your question in the chat. And I will call upon people in the order in which they raise their hands. So Dr. Lehrman, your hand is up. I'll have to ask you to unmute. Now you should be able to.
Thank you so much, Professor Rifkin. It's such a pleasure to meet you and to learn that Hofstra is so involved in teaching Russian and Russian history. My mother worked there as the librarian that cataloged the Russian collection for 4 years back in the 1960s. And I have dozens of recordings and books that she was giving them to Queens College, and with Tom Bird was our contact there. But we would love to work with Hofstra, because Hofstra means a great deal to us too. I would like to know from one of the panelists, probably Eleanor, who was closest to this, a little bit more about the story of the death of the three martyrs that you mentioned, particularly Ilya Krychevsky, who was the only Jewish one of the three martyrs, who was memorialized by a poem by the late Joel Shatsky, which I set to music, and I put in the chat a recording that we did for Center Makor, the Russian Jewish Center in Boston. But I know very little myself about how Krychevsky died and the others died, and what happened right before that and right after it. I don't think it was in the film. Am I wrong?
It was not in the film. Because the film was focused on events in Leningrad, and there was only a reference at that time to a victim in the Baltics.
Right.
I have in my notes here somewhere the name of the three people, but I believe, and Eleanor, if you can confirm, that they were crushed by a tank. Eleanor, are you aware of that?
I was aware of it, but I should say that I became very aware as we were living through these events that each one of us only knew what we could see with our own eyes. And if you were in the United States watching CNN, you knew more about what was happening than I did. I was sitting in the Russian parliament, and I was not on Tchaikovsky Street where the three boys attacked a tank. They were very brave. They jumped up on the tank and they attacked the tank, and they were killed. But later, there was a funeral for them, and it was a very important funeral. And all of the Western ambassadors were invited to the funeral. And the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Alexei, officiated at that funeral.
Is there literature or footage of that funeral? Do you know?
There must be. I'm not personally aware of it, but I'm sure you could find it.
Oh, I'd need some help, but thank you.
And Dr. Lehrman, please do get in touch with me by email. If you Google me by my name and Hofstra, it'll come up right away. Okay, thank you. Other questions? Question from one of our participants for you, Eleanor. A Hofstra student is wondering if there was any kind of monitoring or watch on the information that you were sending to the embassy and on to Washington, and what kind of position that task put you in. Were you at all, did you feel at any time that you were potentially at risk yourself as events unfolded?
I never felt that I was at risk. Maybe I was naive, but those crowds in the square around the White House were very sympathetic to Yeltsin and to what was happening. And I did not feel that I was in danger walking through those crowds. I know I was observed. The KGB saw everything that we did, but usually they didn't interfere with us. And when we got inside the Russian White House, I don't think there was any danger. I physically carried my pad into the White House, and I physically gave the notes to the courier, who physically brought them to the embassy, which transmitted the information on what we assumed was a secure line. So there may have been some monitoring, but I never felt that it affected me personally.
Thank you. I think that the coup plotters had more worries to contend with than what Americans were communicating about what was happening in Moscow, because they had to deal with what was happening in Moscow, which was the enormous courage and bravery of the people of Moscow, the people in Moscow, standing up to the tanks and convincing the tank drivers, the tank drivers. I'm not sure if we have that term in English. In Russian, it's so much easier, tankisty, to not shoot at the Russian people. Don't shoot your own people. And I see a hand up from Mr. Stoddard, and so I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can ask your question.
Yeah, just historical speculation. What do people think, and I'm asking of the panelists particularly, but anyone, would have happened had the coup not taken place? And we know that it was self-defeating. It attempted to preserve the Soviet Union, and it's sped up the demise. I suspect that the Soviet Union was doomed anyway, and that the nations, the republics, would have split anyway. But some things probably would have been different, and I'd be interested if anyone has any considered thoughts on that.
Thank you. Let's turn to our panelists about just what you think might have happened had the coup not occurred in terms of the what if kind of history.
It's really difficult to say because of the conjunctive mood of history. There are so many scenarios, but I agree with your question, well, actually with your observation, Mr. Stoller, that everything is going to be the same. Of course, I don't have any proofs. It's just the feeling. Maybe because I was young, I was 22 at the time, and the general emotion, which my friends, as I believe, shared was that this is not the end of the history, the coup, but just some kind of a stone which blocks the movement towards the bright future. I actually believe that the coup was the logical end of Gorbachev's perestroika. And this is the end of the Soviet period on this optimistic note. And the second August tragic event in 1993, this is the beginning of contemporary Russia, which we still have today.
Ilya, that was wonderful, and I fully agree with you. I think you're spot on there. I invite the other panelists to share their thoughts. Maybe somebody had a different vision of what could have happened had there not been a coup. I think that had the Confederation Papers been signed, it wouldn't have been a long-lasting affiliation. Natasha, you wanted to contribute something.
Yeah, I agree with Ilya. It's really very hard to say what would be happening at this time. But you know what struck me later when it happened in 1993? People not even looked at this. It was a tanks around the White House, and people just walked away and just staying outside and watching what's going on, like an event. I don't know what the first coup, what kind of changes in people's psychology happened, that they think it's a normal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think you're very right, and it's a process of desensitization. And we can see that in our own society with other things. George Delich commented on chat, isn't it ironic that Putin fears exactly such protest crowds as shown in this film, where there was no interference with their assembly? And I think that's a very profound observation about contemporary Russia. Are there any other questions tonight? The question from Melvin Thomas, who says that thank you to the panelists, two of whom I have the honor of calling my teachers. Well, I picked very well, obviously, didn't I, Melvin? The question is, did you, your parents or grandparents fear that the Soviet Union was in danger of falling into another civil war the way that it happened after the collapse of the Russian Empire?
Wow.
Very hard question to answer. Melvin, very happy to see you here. I think my grandparents who went through the World War II, and my grandmother was walking away from Minsk when it was completely destroyed, holding my father in her hands, and the rest of the family died in a ghetto in Minsk. I think they were shocked because they believed in the Soviet Union, in the Communist Party. They grew up with that. You cannot cross out your life, your beliefs. But I think the main word that I got from my grandmother, she always said, it's everything, just no war, just not, they were really, really scared, I would say this way about this. They generation of the Stalin's time, they talk, but sometimes they would like to reserve their comments in front of the kids and grandchildren sometimes.
And this is the impact of trauma across generations. right?
Yeah, but if I may,
Please.
Melvin, thanks for the question. I think when the events are developing in such pace, one after another, within basically 2 days, we did not have time, neither my parents or grandparents, to think about historical analogies. We were just living exactly, we were deeply immersed into the present. So our time coincided with the moment we lived through. If we had thought, or they had thought about the future coup or something, they would have definitely thought about possibility of civil war and all consequences of the revolutions in 1917. But I do think that at least in Moscow, and in Leningrad, people were thinking about today, now, about their hopes, but not about their past. But I may be wrong. My mother actually was more afraid of the pogroms, but before the coup, during the coup, we were as if like focused, concentrated on this piece of time which we eyewitnessed and went through.
Ilya, thank you. And I think I'm going to take the prerogative of using that comment as an opportunity for us to wrap up our evening together tonight. It's already 9:45. And I just want to say that it is with clarity of hindsight that we understand the impact of one or another historical event. And as we're living through it, we are, as Ilya said, focused on what is happening right now and how can I be safe and how can I, what does it mean for me to try to be brave? And what does it mean for our country to live through this experience together as a community? Looking back in history is much easier than living through it. And there is no country for which that is truer than Russia, whose history is as interesting to study as it is awful to live through. I thank everyone, all the panelists tonight for your contributions, for helping us understand this event. And I also thank all our attendees for joining us tonight. You will get a message from Hofstra University letting you know when the recording of my remarks at the beginning of tonight's event and the panel discussion are put into the Hofstra archive. And I wish all of you, as you look forward to celebrations of holidays at the end of the year, that you are safe and healthy and are able to celebrate with friends and family also safely, and be mindful of the fact that we are living in history right now. Thank you all. And on behalf of Hofstra University, the Department of Comparative Literature, Languages and Linguistics, and the Department of History, I wish you all a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you. Appreciate it.